Masechet Nazir Daf Mem Aleph. This daf is going to cover a very important and relevant halachic topic. We've been talking about the prohibition of shaving one's beard with a razor. So that prohibition applies only with a razor. One cannot use a razor on one's face. And that covers 5 points. As machlokes exactly where the 5 points are, maybe here and here. Maybe here and here or here or here. So somewhere around the face. And so therefore don't use a razor anywhere on one's face for one's beard. However, that prohibition only applies to a razor. One is permitted to shave one's beard with other instruments like a scissor, depilatory, and according to most opinions, electric shavers, or maybe laser removal, or other ways. It's just a razor that is prohibited. Okay, that is one prohibition. Now there is another very closely related prohibition of not rounding out one's head and to have a haircut like a monk. This is associated with idolatry, being different from the style of other nations, and so one cannot do that. And so this will include leaving the peot for a certain length. Now, this prohibition, there's a machloket about whether that's only with a razor or also other instruments. According to Rambam, that prohibition of peot and rounding out is also only with a razor. That's a tremendous leniency. It would mean that if you're not using a razor, you're using something else, just like you can shave the beard, so too you'd be able to shave peot. However, Rambam, even though Shulchan Aruch quotes it, says one should be stringent according to the other opinion of other Rishonim that say that the prohibition against peot and rounding out applies to any instrument. Even if you're just using a scissor or something else, one is not allowed to remove that hair in any way. Now, this is a very important halacha if somebody wants to shave their head. Sometimes people, when they start going bald, they want to be proactive and just shave their whole head. Is it permitted for a Jewish man to shave his entire head, or does he have to leave the peot? It seems, according to most opinions, Shulchan Aruch saying one should be machmir, that one cannot entirely remove the peot. They can be cut short, but would have to leave them a certain length. That is the so all this is going to be discussed in this Gemara today, and we'll see the source of it. All right, let's go back to the context. What are we talking about? We saw that there's three people that must shave their parts of the body or their whole body or parts of their body with a razor. And that is the Nazir, has to shave his head, all of his head, with a razor. And the Levi has to shave his head and his whole body with a razor. And the Mesorah. The first two, it says explicitly. Mesorah does not say explicitly. So we're looking for a source that Mesorah must shave with a razor. So we answer this according to Rabbanan. Okay, there's a machloket between Rabbanan and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbanan say that the prohibition against shaving a beard is only with a razor. That's what we follow, l'halakha. That's why we're allowed to shave it all with other instruments. Okay, so because of that, Rabbanan looked to this pasuk here regarding Mesorah that says you have to shave all of his hair, and then it specifies Rosho Zekano. Why does it have to go out of its way to say a beard also? Oh, must be that this is coming to override the prohibition against shaving with a beard. That's the usual prohibition for most people. Now, that prohibition is only with a razor, according to Rabbanan. And so if over here, if it's saying, a Mesorah can shave his beard, well, we wouldn't need to override it if he could shave his beard with another thing, with a scissor. So it must be that he must use a razor, because that's the only reason why you'd have to put zikano to override the prohibition against shaving with a razor. That was the source for Rabbanan that we saw yesterday. But now we're still left to ask Rabbi Eliezer, where is your source? Since according to you, Rabbi Eliezer, there's a prohibition against shaving one's beard with the other instruments also, tweezer and a carpenter's plane. So then you can say that zikano, and so zikano is prohibited in any way. So then this you would need zikano to override also shaving with other instruments. And so there's no proof from here that you have to use a razor specifically. And so instead, Rabbi Eliezer is going to focus on this word, the word rosho. So let's see how he does that. Rabbi Eliezer, my ta'amad Rabbi Eliezer, what's your source that a mesorah must use a razor? Yalef merosho. The extra word that a mesorah says he has to remove all his body, and then it says his head. Isn't the head part of his body? Why do you have to say that? Tetanya rosho. Ma tamud lomar. Levish nemar gaben nazir ta'ar lo yavol ad rosho. Yachol af nazir mesorah ken tamud lomar rosho. So Rabbi Eliezer has a modification here, and he's going to learn it from a Nazir who becomes a Mesorah, right? And anyone could become a Mesorah. It's not up to you. And so someone as a Nazir, they vowed to be a Nazir, in the middle of Nazirut, all of a sudden, they they got Sara'at. They contracted it. So now they purify, go through the ritual process, and then at the end of the ritual process, he has to shave his head. He has to shave his whole body as a mesorah, including his head. But a Nazir is not allowed to shave his head. So what is Nazir mesorah going to do? The word Roshah comes to say that regarding a Nazir, even though a Nazir may not shave his head, how about a Nazir who is a mesorah? Would you say that maybe if he cannot shave his head, maybe he'll shave the rest of his body for his mesorah thing, but you have to leave his head because he's a Nazir? No, that's why he says regarding mesorah, the extra word, Roshah, to say, even though he's a Nazir, we override it. Now, this proof assumes that a Nazir only violates his Nazirut if he shaves with a razor. That was one opinion of a couple of others, of Rabbi Yonatan, 2 days ago. He said that a Nazir, in the middle of his Nazirut, only violates the prohibition and gets lashes if he uses a razor. But if he just cuts his hair with a scissor or something else, then he does not get lashes. He is not liable. Okay, so if we follow that, then this logic works. Since the pasuk goes out of its way regarding mesorah to say that he has to shave his head, and that teaches that even though he's a Nazir, he can violate his Nazirut. He must violate his Nazirut, but his violating of Nazirut only occurs if he uses a razor. So it must be that a mesorah must use a razor. That's the source of Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, brilliant. Now we're going to question it. Mimai. Maybe a mesorah can actually use also tweezers and a carpenter's plane, and he could use that also, or a razor. He can use all those for his concluding ceremony. And then if you'll say, how come I need this extra word, Roshah, to teach me about a Nazir, that he, even though a Nazir cannot use a razor, but a Nazir mesorah can shave his hair with a razor. Maybe that all just means he can even use a razor. It doesn't necessarily mean only that he can only use a razor. And here's why I would need that word Roshah, because I might think, since a Nazir, if he shaves with a razor in the middle of Nazirut, he would be liable. So a Mesorah, Mesorah also would be liable even when he's shaving, if he's a Nazir and a Mesorah, and he wouldn't be allowed, and he would have to use one of the other methods that is permitted, like using tweezers or a carpenter's plane, and therefore the word Roshah comes to teach that no, it's okay. Here the Mesorah has options. Mesorah Nazir can shave his head using tweezers, carpenter's plane, and he can also use a razor if he wants, and it will override his Nazirut prohibition. And now we reject that and uphold Rabbi Eliezer's proof, and we say, Isa kadatech ki abid b'malket u'birhitim b'sfak ha'abid midela katav ta'ar keresh lakish. No, that won't work. If you think that a mesorah can use tweezers or a carpenter's plane, and that fulfills his ceremonial obligation, then then from the fact that the Mesorah does not explicitly say ta'ad, we would not permit a ta'ad, right? Torah is no way it would do that because of Resh Lakish's principle. Doesn't quote it here because we already quoted it yesterday. Resh Lakish's principle is, when do we say aseh, doche, lo ta'aseh? When the Torah says a positive and negative commandment, the positive commandment overrides. That's only if you cannot fulfill both. If you cannot do the positive commandment without avoiding the prohibition of the negative commandment. If there's a contradiction and you can't do it, then it overrides. But if there's a possibility, if there's a possible way to do the positive commandment without violating the negative commandment, then you're not allowed to violate the negative commandment. That was Resh Lakish's opinion. And therefore, in this case, if you would say that a Mesorah can use tweezers or a carpenter's plane, then he would have to do that and would not be permitted to use a razor. You can't, as a Mesorah, as a Nazir Mesorah, right? There's no reason, there's no justification for a Nazir Mesorah to use a razor when a razor is prohibited, and he can do it in a permitted way. And therefore, there's no way the Torah would permit that. And therefore, if the Torah goes out of its way to say that it's permitted for a Nazir Mesorah to use a razor, it can only be because that he must use a razor and there's no other way to do it. And that's why he's aseh doche lo ta'aseh. And so now this is a good proof for the Eliezer that a Mesorah must use a razor. He learns from the word rosho. Good. Now we're going to go back to Rabbanan. But Rabbanan, hay rosho, my darshebe. Rabbanan, they learned the rule that a Mesorah must use a razor from the word zekano. So Rabbanan, what are you going to do with Rosho? Right? It's a good question. Why do you have to save for the Mesorah? He had to shave all of his hair, and then you specified his zekano and Rosho. Why need Rosho? My darshibe, me'ba'lehu lemidche de lav lemidche lav de hakafa. Detanya lo takifu pe'at roshechem yachol af Mesorah ken tamod omar Rosho. Okay, so the word Rosho for Rabbanan comes to override the prohibition of hakafa, of rounding the corners, of making a haircut like a monk, and that would be and cutting the peot, because the pasuk does prohibit that. In a normal circumstance, one is not allowed to round off the corners of his head, and so you might think maybe a Mesorah also cannot. So therefore, this says Rosho, don't worry, a Mesorah can override can override that. Now we learn something very important from here. So you might think that the only prohibition is just to have a round monk-like haircut, right? But maybe if you shave your whole head, then it would be okay. What you see from here is that a Mesorah, even though he's shaving his whole head, if you didn't have this word Rosho, then he would violate Then he would violate. We need the word Rosho to tell me that if you're a Mesorah, when he shaves his whole head, that overrides the peot. That means someone who's not a Mesorah and shaves his whole head, including his peot, does violate the lo takifu pe'at roshechem. Right? In other words, it's not only a prohibition of having a round haircut, that you can't cut your peot and leave the rest, that for sure is prohibited, then you look like a monk. But even if you're shaving your entire top, you also cannot shave the peot. That's the consequence of this derasha. Okay. Lama lemichtav rosho v'tepuk lemezekano. Now, according to Rabbanan, hold on. Why do you need the word rosho? Why can't you learn it from zekano? In other words, from zekano, you learn the principle that aseh is doche lo ta'aseh, and we know you can't shave your beard with a razor. And yet it says zekano to say that a Mesorah can. It overrides. So from there we learn the principle that aseh doche lo ta'aseh. And once I know that principle, then I could figure it out myself that when he's shaving his entire head, then that overrides cutting the corners of his head as well. So why do I need the word rosho to add to that? Detanya zekano ma tamud lomar lefi shenemar ufat zekanam lo yigalechu yachol hamesora ken tamud lomar zekano. And here's the braita that we already know from yesterday that told me what zekano means. The word zekano, that the Mesorah shaves his beard. Why do I need that? It already said his whole body he shaves, because since the pasuk says you cannot cut your beard with a razor, I would think a Mesorah also. That's why I need Zekano. So now, since Zekano teaches me the principle of Aseh, Tochelo Ta'aseh, now I already know it for the corners of his head, not making it round. So I don't need the word Rosho. So Lama limichtav Rosho, Lama limichtav Zekano. Why do I need both? And so here's the answer for Rabbanan. Serichi di katav rachamana zekano velo katav rosho hava amina hakafat kol harosh lo shema hakafa lehachi katav rachamana rosho. So I need them both, because if I only had beard and I didn't have anything about the head, I would say that maybe cutting shaving one's entire head is not a problem of rounding out. Maybe I would think it's only a problem of rounding the corners of one's head if one leaves the top like a monk and only shaves the corners. But if I shave my entire head, then it's permitted to shave off the corners. That's what I would have thought if I only had zekana, because there's no other word that tells me that anything else has to be overridden. I would think I don't need to override it. So that's why the pasuk comes and says Rosho. The way that a Mesorah shaves his head, which is a total shaving of all of his hair, normally would violate the problem of pe'ot, if not for the word Rosho to tell me that a Mesorah can do it and it does override. So from the fact that it says an extra word to say that a Mesorah can override the prohibition of Pe'at Zekanam teaches me that in general, shaving one's entire head is a violation of Pe'at Zekanam. So that's it. This is where we learn this important and relevant halacha, that even if one is shaving his entire head, it is still prohibited. Okay, so we know it's for sure prohibited, even if you're shaving your entire head. So for sure, there's no question, one cannot have a monk-like haircut. But we see that, according to the Gemara here, one cannot shave one's entire head. If one shaves one's entire head, one still cannot shave the pe'ot. The only question of the Rishonim is, with what instrument? For sure, with a razor it would not be prohibited. What about not with a razor? Rambam is lenient, but most Rishonim are stringent, and Shulchan Aruch, although quotes Rambam, says one should be stringent. And so right here, this is the source. Okay, that's why we need the word Rosho there. But now the next thing is, what if we just had Rosho? V'katav Rosho v'lo katav zekano. Hava amina mashma tarte. So if I had only Rosho, I could learn two things. And why do I need zekano? So with just Rosho, I can learn from that word two things. Number one, da te'aseh v'dachelo ta'aseh mashma ta'kafat kol rosh hakafa. Ve'akate betar minelan lachi katav rachamana zekano. So if I had only the word Rosho, I'll say it out of order. I think it makes more sense. One, if I had Rosho, I would learn from that that even if you shave your entire head, a man shaves his entire head, still that would be a problem, nor for a regular person, of cutting his pe'ot, and because that's why the pasuk needs the word Rosho regarding Mesorah to say Mesorah is permitted. That is he's an exception in which the mitzvah of a Mesorah overrides the general prohibition. So this teaches us that the general prohibition of pe'ot includes not only when he leaves the top of his hair, even if he shaves his whole head, he still can't cut his pe'ot. That's one thing I learned from the word Rosho. I also learned from that a general rule that aseh doche lo ta'aseh, a Mesorah, mitzvah ta'aseh, to shave everything, including his head, and that overrides the commandment not to cut the pe'ot. So all that I would know from Rosho, and based on that, I would also know that cutting the beard is overridden, and even though usually you can't cut a beard, but a Mesorah can cut a beard, I would know that based on the principle of aseh doche lo ta'aseh. But if I didn't have the word zekano, What I would be missing is knowing that I have to use a razor. Since, according to Rabbanan, one only violates Baal Tashchit when using a razor, so this, and then Mesorah goes out of its way to specify a beard, why would you need that extra word? I already know, Aseh doche lo ta'aseh. Oh, it must be teaching us that that just like the prohibition is only with a razor, Mesorah says you can even cut your beard. Well, that means that it overrides. And I only would need to know that it overrides if the Mesorah has to use a razor, as we said yesterday. If a Mesorah would be able to use something else to cut his beard, then you wouldn't need the word zekano to override the prohibition, because there is no prohibition using scissor, according to Rabbanan. So therefore, the word zekano comes to teach me that not that a Mesorah can shave his beard, that we know, aseh doche lo ta'aseh. It actually says the word zekano there to teach me that the Mesorah has to use a razor to cut it, because that's going out of its way to say, specifically zekano, you can even override the prohibition of cutting a beard, which prohibition is only prohibited with a razor, according to Rabbanan, and yet a Mesorah can do it. That's how we know a Mesorah can and must use a razor. So that's why we need both. All right, now back to the Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, da'ateh aseh v'dache lo ta'aseh minale. How does Rabbi Eliezer know the general principle that aseh doche lo ta'aseh? Now, it does seem that Rabbi Eliezer could learn this. He already did from the word rosho, because that does override. To say a Mesorah can override, even if he's a Nazir. But the commentaries here give different answers to that question. Okay, so maybe it's because he has to teach that for a Kohen or something else. So you can look here at this note regarding that. But assuming that he cannot learn it from Zikano and from Rosho, where else could he learn this principle from? And the answer is Yalef Megidilim. He can learn it from the law of Sisit. How? The Tanya lo tilbash shatnez. And Devarim says one is not allowed to wear wool and linen together. And then in the very next pasuk it says ha gedilim ta'selach mehem. It says that one does wear sisit. So because the Torah puts these two laws back to back, we learn from the juxtaposition that yes, it's true in general you're not allowed to wear wool and linen. But if you need to fulfill the law of sisit and you want to wear a linen garment, that's great. You're allowed to wear a linen garment. But if it's a rectangle garment that has four corners, then you need to put sisit on it. Techelet has to be made out of wool. So then you're going to necessarily need to wear wool and linen together. And that is permitted. That's why it's here back to back to tell you that sisit is an exception and overrides the prohibition of shatnez. So this is an example of aseh doche lo ta'aseh, and from here we can learn to this general rule and then apply it to other places in the Torah. Baruch Adonai Olam, Amen ve'amen.